The sun was beating down hard on the concrete, creating waves of heat that rose up from the ground. It was one of those afternoons where the sky was a painfully bright blue, not a single cloud to be found anywhere. In the distance, the large commercial jets were taking off, roaring into the sky, but here on the private side of the airfield, things were quieter. There was no noise except for the hum of a small ground power unit, and the wind whistling softly through the metal structures of the hangar. Standing on the tarmac was a man who looked like he didn't quite belong in such a fancy setting, yet he owned it. He was dressed in a simple, dark jacket that had seen better days, a pair of jeans, and worn-out boots. He had a small duffel bag thrown over one shoulder. To anyone walking by, he might have looked like a mechanic or a pilot waiting for his shift. But if you looked closer, you would recognize the face. It was Keanu Reeves. He didn't have a squad of security guards around him. He didn't have a manager shouting into a phone. He was just a man, walking with a heavy kind of tiredness in his eyes, heading toward a sleek white jet that had his name on the passenger list. The plane was beautiful. It was polished to a shine so bright it looked like a mirror reflecting the sky. The metal stairs were folded down, waiting for him to climb up. Keanu walked slowly, taking his time. He seemed to be enjoying the feeling of the ground under his feet before he had to step into the flying machine. He was looking forward to getting on board, sitting in a comfortable seat, and maybe closing his eyes for a few hours. He had been working non-stop for months, and this flight was his chance to breathe. As he got closer to the stairs, a young man in a high-visibility vest stepped out from the shadow of the plane. This was the ground crew member, a guy who took his job very seriously. He had a clipboard in his hand and a headset on his ear. He watched Keanu approach, but he didn't smile. He didn't look like a fan who recognized a movie star. He looked like an employee checking for a security breach. To him, this was just another person walking toward a restricted area, and if that person wasn't on the paper in his hand, they weren't getting in. Keanu stopped at the bottom of the metal stairs. He nodded at the young man, a polite gesture of hello. He adjusted the strap of his bag and prepared to climb up. He expected the usual routine, a quick check of his ID, maybe a handshake, and then he would be on his way. But the young man didn't move. He held up a hand, palm out, in a universal sign for stop. "Sir, you can't go up there," the crew member said. His voice was firm, but there was a slight tremble in it. He was new to the job, and he was nervous about enforcing the rules with someone who looked confident. Keanu paused. He looked at the stairs, then back at the man. "Oh, I'm sorry," Keanu said. His voice was soft, very different from the tough characters he plays in movies. "I thought this was the flight to New York. I'm booked on this one." The crew member looked down at his clipboard. He flipped a page, then flipped it back. He ran his finger down a list of names. "There is no one on the manifest by that description. I can't allow unauthorized personnel to board the aircraft." It's a strict safety regulation. Keanu didn't get angry. He didn't sigh or roll his eyes. He just stood there, looking at the young man with a patient expression. He understood that the guy was just doing what he was told. "Okay," Keanu said simply. "I understand, safety first." It was a strange moment. Here was one of the most famous actors in the world, a man who could buy the airline if he wanted to, being told he couldn't get on a plane that was chartered for him. Most people would have pulled out a phone, called a lawyer, or started yelling about who they were. But Keanu just stood there, the sun warming his face. He looked like a traveler who had missed his bus and was just figuring out what to do next. The crew member shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He looked at the plane, then back at Keanu. He picked up his radio handset. He pressed the button on the side. "Dispatch, this is Ground 4. I have a male at the stairwell requesting boarding on Flight Alpha 7. Name is not appearing on my physical copy. Please verify." Static crackled back from the radio. A voice answered, but it was broken up and hard to hear. The wind was picking up a little, blowing dust across the tarmac. Keanu watched the dust swirl. He didn't tap his foot. He didn't check his watch. He just waited. He seemed to be in no rush at all, even though every minute that passed was a minute less of rest he would get. While the crew member tried to get an answer on the radio, Keanu took a step back. He didn't want to crowd the man or make him feel more nervous. He walked over to a nearby metal bench that sat under the wing of a smaller, parked plane. It wasn't a comfortable bench. It was made of cold, slatted metal with a peeling paint job, but it offered a place to sit. He lowered himself down and placed his duffel bag on the ground next to his boots. He leaned back, resting his arms on his knees. From this angle, he could see the tires of the jet. They were massive, rubber beasts that held up the tons of steel. He looked at the complex machinery of the landing gear. It fascinated him, the way things were built to work so perfectly together. The young man with the clipboard was still on the radio, his voice getting a little louder as he tried to get through to someone who could fix the mistake. "I need confirmation for Passenger Reeves," he said. "Repeat, Passenger K. Reeves." Hearing his name, Keanu looked up. He saw the stress on the young man's face. He could tell the guy was worried he had made a mistake or that he was going to be in trouble. Keanu wanted to tell him it was okay, that it didn't matter. He thought about standing up and walking over to reassure him, but he decided it was better to just stay out of the way. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone who is stressed is to just let them do their work without an audience. So, Keanu sat on the hard metal bench, alone in the sun. He watched a bird land on the tail of the jet ahead. The bird chirped loudly, then flew off. He took a deep breath of the air, which smelled of jet fuel and hot asphalt. It wasn't a sweet smell, but it was the smell of travel. It was the smell of going somewhere. He thought about where he was going. He thought about the people he was going to meet. But mostly, he just enjoyed the silence. It was rare for him to have a moment like this, where he wasn't surrounded by noise or expectations. Here, he was just a guy sitting on a bench, denied entry to a plane, waiting for the world to catch up. The ground crew member finally put the radio down. He looked over at Keanu, looking apologetic. "We are trying to sort it out, sir. The system is updating. It might be a few more minutes." "No problem," Keanu called back. He gave a small, reassuring smile. "Take your time." The young man nodded, looking relieved that the passenger wasn't shouting at him. He turned back to his clipboard, leaving Keanu to his thoughts. The sun continued to shine down on the tarmac, relentless and bright. The engines of the jet remained silent, waiting for the moment they would roar to life. But for now, everything was still. Keanu adjusted his jacket, closed his eyes for a brief second, and let the quiet moment wash over him. He was in no hurry. He was just waiting for the door to open. The minutes began to tick by, slow and heavy like honey dripping from a spoon. The sun did not move much, but the heat seemed to intensify, pressing down on the tarmac like a heavy blanket. Keanu sat on the metal bench, his boots resting firmly on the dusty concrete. He wasn't checking his watch. He wasn't tapping his fingers with impatience. He was just sitting there, existing in the moment, which is something very few people know how to do anymore. From where he sat, the world of the airport looked different. It wasn't about the rush to get somewhere or the stress of making a connection. It was just machinery and people trying to make things work. He watched a baggage cart drive by in the distance, a small orange vehicle zooming between the massive tails of commercial airliners. The driver was wearing a vest, just like the young man near the stairs, and Keanu wondered what his day was like. It was a habit he had, looking at people and wondering about their stories, imagining that everyone was the main character in their own movie. The young crew member was still on the radio. He had walked a few steps away, cupping his hand over his ear to hear better. Keanu could see the tension in the young man's shoulders. They were up tight near his ears. He was probably worried that he had messed up or that he was holding up a VIP. Keanu wanted to stand up and tell him to relax, that the world wasn't going to end because of a delay. But he stayed put. He knew that sometimes when people are stressed, the kindest thing you can do is give them space to figure it out. Instead, Keanu focused on the plane in front of him. It was a beautiful piece of engineering. The white paint gleamed, and the stripes along the side were perfectly straight. He looked at the tires, big and black, squashed slightly under the weight of the fuel and the metal frame. He thought about the physics of flight, how something so heavy could lift off the ground and soar through the air. It always seemed like a miracle to him, no matter how many times he did it. He respected the machine. He respected the complexity of it all. He shifted his weight on the bench. The metal was warm, almost hot, through his jeans. He took a deep breath, smelling the distinct scent of jet fuel mixed with hot rubber. It wasn't a pleasant smell, but it was an honest one. It was the smell of effort and power. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the airfield wash over him. There was the distant whine of a jet engine starting up. the clatter of a metal tool being dropped somewhere far away, and the hum of the power unit connected to his own plane. It was a noisy kind of silence, a chaotic peace that he actually enjoyed. When he opened his eyes, his gaze drifted up to the cockpit windows. They were small and oval, reflecting the bright sky. Because of the angle and the light inside, he could see the shapes of the pilots. There were two of them. The one in the left seat, the captain, was moving his arms. He looked like he was going through a checklist. Keanu watched him. It was a mesmerizing kind of rhythm. The pilot would point at a gauge, say something to the other pilot, and then flip a switch. It looked like a well-rehearsed dance, a routine they had done 1,000 times before. Keanu admired that kind of discipline. In his job, he had to memorize lines and hit marks, but he knew that for pilots, the stakes were much higher. They had people's lives in their hands. He watched the captain adjust his headset and then lean forward to look at a screen on the dashboard. Everything seemed normal. It looked like a standard pre-flight procedure. There was no sign that anything was wrong. The young crew member walked back toward the plane, looking a bit defeated. He shook his head at Keanu, signaling that he still hadn't gotten through to the right person. "I'm trying a different channel, sir," he called out. "Just a few more minutes." Keanu gave him a thumbs up. "Take all the time you need," he replied. He meant it. He wasn't in a rush. He knew that eventually the paperwork would get sorted out. Or maybe it wouldn't, and he would just take a car or a train. It didn't matter. The destination wasn't as important as the journey, a cliché that he actually believed in. He looked back at the cockpit. The captain was reaching for something above his head, maybe adjusting the air conditioning or the overhead lights. Then his hand stopped. It just froze in midair. Keanu watched, thinking maybe the pilot was just stretching or waiting for a response from the tower. But the hand didn't move down. It stayed there, suspended, gripping the handle of the control panel. A strange feeling crept into Keanu's chest. It wasn't panic, not yet. It was just a sense that something had shifted. The rhythm was broken, the dance had stopped. The co-pilot sitting in the right seat turned his head. He looked at the captain. Keanu saw the co-pilot say something. The captain didn't respond. His head didn't turn. His hand remained frozen in the air. From this distance, through the thick glass, Keanu couldn't see the captain's face clearly, but the posture of the man had changed. He had gone from looking alert and professional to looking like a statue, rigid and unmoving. The co-pilot reached over and touched the captain's arm. It was a gentle touch, just a tap. But the captain didn't react. He didn't pull his arm away or nod or signal that he was okay. He just sat there, slumped slightly forward against his harness, his hand still glued to the overhead handle. Keanu stood up. He didn't know why he stood up exactly. His body just reacted to the scene before him. He dropped his duffel bag on the ground. The young crew member had his back to the plane, still fiddling with his radio and clipboard. He hadn't seen it yet. He was still worried about the manifest and the names on the list. He was worried about the rules. He didn't know that the rules had just become the least important thing on the airfield. Through the glass, the situation escalated quickly. The co-pilot wasn't just tapping the captain anymore. He was unbuckling his own seatbelt, trying to get closer to the other man. Keanu saw the co-pilot's face clearly now as he turned toward the window. The co-pilot was pale. His eyes were wide with a look of pure fear. He wasn't looking at his instruments anymore. He was looking for help. He looked down out of the window and saw Keanu standing there by the bench. The co-pilot started waving his hands. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was a frantic, desperate motion. He pointed at the captain, then grabbed his own chest, mimicking a heart attack or a seizure. He was shouting something, but the glass was too thick for the sound to carry. All Keanu could hear was the wind and the hum of the ground power unit. The young crew member heard Keanu move. He turned around, surprised to see the passenger standing so close to the plane. "Sir, please stay back," the young man started to say, his voice automatic. "Look," Keanu said. He pointed up at the cockpit. His voice was calm, but there was an urgency underneath it. "Look at the captain." The crew member turned his head upward. He squinted against the sun, shielding his eyes with his hand. When he saw what was happening, the radio slipped from his fingers and crashed onto the concrete with a loud clatter. The captain hadn't moved an inch. He was frozen in place, a prisoner of his own body, while the co-pilot fought to reach him from the adjacent seat. The peacefulness of the afternoon shattered in an instant, replaced by the sudden, chilling realization that a life was hanging in the balance just a few feet above their heads. The sound of the radio hitting the concrete was sharp and loud, like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. It spun around on the ground for a second before coming to a rest near a patch of dried weeds. The young crew member just stared at it, his mouth slightly open, as if his brain couldn't process that he had dropped it. He looked back up at the cockpit, then down at his feet, then up again. He was frozen in place, trapped by the sudden realization that something terrible was happening inside that plane. Keanu, however, didn't freeze. The moment he saw the co-pilot's desperate hands waving against the glass, his body switched gears. He wasn't a movie star anymore, and he wasn't a passenger. He was just a person who saw another person in trouble. He dropped his bag next to the bench. It landed with a heavy thud, but he didn't even look back at it. His eyes were locked on the metal stairs leading up to the plane. "He's not moving," the crew member stammered, his voice cracking. I think he's having a seizure or a heart attack." "I don't know. Call for help," Keanu said. His voice was low and steady, cutting through the younger man's panic. "Call 911 or ground control. Get a medic here now." Then Keanu moved. He didn't run with panic. He ran with purpose. His boots hit the tarmac with a solid rhythm as he covered the distance to the stairs. He was fast, much faster than the crew member expected. The young man stood there for a split second, watching him, then scrambled to pick up his radio, his hands shaking so badly he nearly fumbled it twice. At the top of the stairs, the main cabin entrance was a sealed metal hatch. It looked imposing and locked tight from the outside. Keanu grabbed the handrail, his knuckles white, and looked through the small, thick glass window set into the hatch. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit, quiet and empty. He couldn't see the cockpit from this angle, but he could hear a muffled sound, a rhythmic thumping, like someone banging a hand against a bulkhead. He turned back to look at the ground crew member. "Is there a code or a lever? It unlocks from the inside," the young man shouted back, finally getting the radio to his mouth. "Ground to medical, emergency at Hangar 4, Jet Alpha 7. Pilot is incapacitated, requesting immediate assistance." Keanu looked back at the cockpit window. The co-pilot was still frantic. He saw the co-pilot reach over, violently undoing his own seatbelt with one hand while trying to keep the other hand on the control yoke. The co-pilot looked terrified. He was alone up there, responsible for the massive machine and the life of the stricken captain, and he was moments away from jumping out of his seat to help. "Let him know I'm here," Keanu yelled up toward the cockpit, knowing the glass was too thick for his voice to carry. He waved his hands, trying to catch the co-pilot's eye. He pointed to the hatch and gave a thumbs up, hoping the co-pilot would understand that help was right outside. It must have worked, or maybe the co-pilot was just desperate. Inside the plane, there was a loud hiss of air. The handle on the hatch twisted. The heavy metal door popped outward slightly, then swung open with a smooth, hydraulic sigh. Cool, conditioned air rushed out to meet the hot tarmac air. It smelled of leather, ozone, and expensive coffee. Keanu didn't hesitate. He stepped up into the cabin, ducking his head to clear the frame. The inside of the jet was stunning, all polished wood and cream-colored leather, but he didn't stop to look at any of it. He moved down the narrow aisle, his steps quick and light on the plush carpeting. The cockpit door was already open, and the sound of heavy breathing filled the small space. When he reached the cockpit, the sight was even more alarming than it looked from the ground. The captain, a man with graying hair and a mustache, was slumped heavily to the left. His safety straps were holding him in the seat, but his head was lolled forward at an unnatural angle. His eyes were rolled back, and a line of drool was escaping from the corner of his mouth. He was making a guttural, snoring sound, a sign that his airway was partially blocked. The co-pilot, a younger man with short-cropped hair, was half standing, his knee on his own seat, reaching over to try to hold the captain's head up. He looked at Keanu with wild eyes. "I don't know what to do," he gasped. He just grabbed his chest and froze up. "I can't leave the controls to get to him properly, and I can't get him out of the seat by myself." "It's okay," Keanu said. He stepped into the tight space between the two seats. It was cramped. There were switches, screens, and levers everywhere, and not much room for a grown man to squeeze in. But Keanu made himself small. He didn't touch the controls. He didn't try to fly the plane. He focused entirely on the man who was suffering. "I've got him," Keanu said firmly. He reached out and gently cupped the captain's face with one hand, tilting the man's head back slightly to open the airway. With his other hand, he reached around to check the captain's pulse on his neck. It was there, but it was thready and fast, like a bird trapped in a cage. The co-pilot slumped back into his own seat, exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding for a minute. "Thank you," he whispered. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "I thought he was dying. I thought he was gone." "He's still with us," Keanu said softly. He looked at the captain's pale face. The man's skin was clammy to the touch. "Can you reach the medical kit?" "Underneath your seat." The co-pilot nodded frantically and bent down, rummaging for the red case. Keanu stayed where he was, anchoring the captain. He started talking to the unconscious man, keeping his voice calm and rhythmic. "Hey, can you hear me? You're doing great. Just stay with us. We're right here. You're on the ground. You're safe." It wasn't about the words exactly. It was about the tone. It was about letting the man know, somewhere in the darkness of his mind, that he wasn't alone. Keanu looked at the captain's name tag on his uniform. It said Captain Davidson. "Captain Davidson," Keanu said a little louder. "Come on back. Open your eyes for me." Behind him, the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, cutting through the quiet afternoon. The young crew member on the ground had done his job. Help was coming. But for now, in the small, glass bubble of the cockpit, it was just the two pilots and the movie star, suspended in a moment of pure humanity. Keanu didn't care about the delay anymore. He didn't care about the movie or the schedule. All he cared about was the faint pulse under his fingertips and the rise and fall of the captain's chest. He held the man's head steady, shielding him from the harsh glare of the sun reflecting off the instrument panels. Waiting for the breath to return, the red medical case landed on the floor of the cockpit with a dull thud. The co-pilot's hands were shaking so badly that he struggled to snap the latches open. He was a trained professional, someone who could handle an engine failure at 30,000 feet, but seeing his mentor and friend slumped unconscious next to him had broken his composure. He looked at Keanu, his eyes wide and wet with panic. I can't get it open," the co-pilot stammered, his voice barely a whisper over the hum of the plane. "Take a breath," Keanu said gently. He didn't let go of the captain's head, keeping the airway clear with a steady, firm grip. "Just focus on your hands." "You can do it," the co-pilot nodded, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He pressed the buttons on the case and it popped open. Inside, there were bandages, oxygen masks, and bottles of pills. Keanu glanced down at the supplies, then back at the captain's face. The older man's skin was turning a shade of gray that scared Keanu. He knew they didn't have much time. "Is there aspirin in there?" Keanu asked. "Or nitroglycerin?" The co-pilot fumbled through the pouches and pulled out a small bottle. "Yes, nitro, but I shouldn't administer it if I'm not sure it's a heart issue." "What if I make it worse?" "He's clutching his chest," Keanu said softly, nodding toward the captain's left hand, which was still frozen in a claw-like grip over his heart. "And look at his color." "We have to try." Just then, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet air, growing louder by the second. The wailing noise echoed off the metal hangars, a signal that help was just seconds away. The co-pilot looked out the windshield and saw the flashing lights of an ambulance crossing the tarmac. The relief washed over his face, but he didn't relax his grip on the medical kit. "They're here," the co-pilot said. "Good," Keanu replied. "But we aren't done yet. Talk to me. Keep him focused." Keanu kept his voice low and rhythmic. "Captain Davidson, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." He placed his hand over the captain's cold fingers. There was no response. The hand was limp. Keanu didn't let that stop him. He kept talking, letting his voice be the anchor that the captain might grab onto in the darkness. He talked about nothing important. How nice the plane was, how the weather was clearing up, how they were going to get him help soon. It was a stream of consciousness designed to fill the silence and keep the fear at bay. Outside, heavy footsteps clanged up the metal stairs. Two paramedics, dressed in dark blue uniforms, appeared at the cockpit entrance. They carried a heavy orange bag and a folded stretcher. They moved with the kind of confident urgency that comes from doing this job every day. "What do we have?" the older paramedic asked as he squeezed into the cramped space. He didn't ask who Keanu was. He didn't care about movie stars, he only cared about the patient. "Male, approximately 50 years old." the co-pilot recited, his voice snapping back into professional mode. Sudden onset of chest pain, then loss of consciousness. He stopped breathing for about 10 seconds, but he's breathing now. It's shallow. The paramedics took over the space instantly. One moved to the captain's side to check his vitals, while the other prepared an IV line. Keanu felt a tap on his shoulder. "Sir, I need you to slide back so we can get to him," the paramedic said kindly but firmly. Keanu didn't argue. He slowly released his support of the captain's head, making sure the other medic had a secure hold before letting go. He stepped back into the narrow aisle, his back pressed against the bulkhead. He was sweating now, the heat of the moment finally catching up with him. He watched as they worked, their hands moving with practiced speed. They tore open packages, inserted needles, and shone lights in the captain's eyes. "We need to get him out of the seat," the lead paramedic said after a moment. "Now, his pressure is dropping. We need to lay him flat." The cockpit was incredibly tight. There was barely enough room for the pilots, let alone 2 paramedics and a patient. Getting an unconscious man out of a bucket seat without hurting him was going to be difficult. "I can help lift," Keanu said from the aisle. He wasn't trying to take over, he just saw a need and filled it. The paramedic looked at him, sizing him up. He saw a strong, capable man in a worn-out jacket. "Okay," he said, "get in here. We need to slide him out on 3. You support the head and shoulders. I've got the legs, my partner will steer the chair." Keanu squeezed back into the gap. He positioned himself, threading his arms under the captain's shoulders. He could feel the captain's weight, heavy and limp. It was a stark reminder of how fragile life is. One minute you are flying a plane, the next you are being carried out of it like a child. "Ready?" the paramedic asked. 1, 2, 3, they lifted together. Keanu used his legs, taking the strain so he wouldn't drop the man. They pivoted slowly, inching the captain out of the confining seat. The captain's head lolled against Keanu's chest. It was an intimate moment, holding a stranger's life in his hands. Keanu looked down at the man's face, which was now covered with an oxygen mask. He whispered, "Stay with us, Captain." Almost there. They maneuvered him out of the cockpit and into the aisle. The cabin, which had seemed so luxurious earlier, now felt cramped and in the way. They laid the captain gently onto the stretcher they had placed on the floor. The paramedics immediately began strapping him in, securing his head and neck to prevent any movement. Keanu stepped back again, giving them room. He leaned against the leather seat in the cabin, wiping his hands on his jeans. His heart was hammering in his chest, not from exertion, but from the adrenaline leaving his body. He felt drained. The co-pilot stepped out of the flight deck. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the last 20 minutes. He leaned against the wall, his head in his hands for a second. Then he looked up and saw Keanu. "You didn't have to do that," the co-pilot said. His voice was thick with emotion. "You could have stayed on the ground. You could have just waited for the police to figure out the paperwork." Keanu shook his head. "He needed help. You were busy flying the plane." "It wasn't really a choice." The co-pilot walked over to him. He wanted to say more, to express how much it meant that a stranger had stepped in to save his friend, but words felt inadequate. He just nodded. "Thank you," he said. "Seriously, thank you." "Don't mention it," Keanu said. He offered a small, tired smile. "Is he going to be okay?" The paramedics were lifting the stretcher now, carrying the captain toward the hatch. "We're moving him now," one of them shouted. "Clear the aisle. He's stable for now," the co-pilot answered, watching them go. "They got to him fast, that's the main thing. If he had been alone up there." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. They both knew how easily it could have been a tragedy. Keanu followed them slowly to the hatch. He stood at the top of the stairs as the paramedics carried the captain down. The sun was still bright, glaring off the tarmac. Down below, the young ground crew member was standing by the ambulance, his face pale as he watched them load the stretcher. He looked up and saw Keanu standing in the plane's entrance. Their eyes met for a second. There was no anger, no annoyance about the delay anymore. There was just a shared look of relief that the man was going to the hospital. Keanu watched until the ambulance doors closed. The sirens wailed again, a sound that usually meant trouble, but this time it sounded like hope. He took a deep breath of the fresh air. The crisis was over, but the feeling of the captain's weight in his arms stayed with him. It grounded him. It reminded him that the glitz and the glamour didn't matter. All that mattered was being there when someone needed a hand. The red tail lights of the ambulance faded into the distance, disappearing behind a row of hangars. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. It wasn't the peaceful silence of earlier. It was the tired silence that comes after a rush of adrenaline. The dust on the tarmac had settled again, and the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, stretched-out shadows across the concrete. Keanu stood at the top of the metal stairs for a moment, looking out at the empty airfield. He took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. His hands felt a bit shaky, a reaction he hadn't felt in a long time. He looked down at his palms, rubbing them together to wipe away the lingering sensation of the captain's cold skin. It was strange how quickly life could shift from normal to chaotic and back to normal again. Down on the ground, the young crew member was standing by the bench where Keanu had sat. He looked small and defeated, his shoulders slumped forward. He was staring at the ground, kicking at a small stone with the toe of his boot. He looked up and saw Keanu standing there. The young man hesitated, then walked slowly toward the stairs. Keanu descended the steps, moving at a calm, easy pace. He didn't want the young man to feel scared. As he reached the bottom, the crew member shifted his weight nervously. "Sir," the young man started. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. He looked like he was on the verge of tears. "I am so sorry, I really am. If I had just let you on when you first arrived. Maybe you would have been in your seat and not out here to see him. I messed up everything. I could have cost him his life." He looked down at his clipboard, which he was holding tightly against his chest. Keanu looked at him. He didn't see a person who had made a mistake. He saw a young kid who was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders because something bad had happened on his watch. Keanu reached out and gently placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. The touch was light, but it stopped the young man's trembling. "Hey," Keanu said softly. "Look at me." The young man looked up, his eyes wide and worried. "You didn't mess anything up," Keanu said. "You were doing your job, you were following the rules. If you had just let me on without checking, that would have been a mistake. But the captain," the young man started. "If you had let me board 10 minutes ago," Keanu said, cutting him off gently, "I would have been sitting in the back with headphones on. I wouldn't have seen anything. Nobody would have known he was in trouble until it was too late. Because you stopped me, because you made me wait out here, I was in the right place to help. You didn't cause the problem. You were part of the solution." The young man blinked, processing what Keanu was saying. It took a moment, but the tension in his face began to soften. "You really think so?" "I know so," Keanu said, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before letting go. "Sometimes things happen for a reason. The delay wasn't bad luck. It was exactly what was supposed to happen." The young man let out a long breath he seemed to have been holding for 20 minutes. He wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his vest. "Thank you," he said. "I was so scared I was going to get fired or worse." "You're going to be fine," Keanu said. "Just keep doing your job like you did." "You did good." At that moment, a black sedan pulled up near the plane. A man in a pilot's uniform stepped out. He looked fresh and alert. He walked over to them, carrying a flight bag. "I'm the relief captain," the new pilot said, nodding to Keanu and the crew member. "I heard about what happened. How is he?" "He was stable when they took him," Keanu answered. "The paramedics got there fast." The relief captain looked at Keanu, really looking at him for the first time. "I heard you helped him out. That was decent of you." "Most people would have just stood there." "I just did what anyone would do," Keanu said. He picked up his duffel bag from the ground where he had left it. The strap felt familiar in his hand again. "Is the plane ready to go?" "We just need to do a quick check of the systems and file a new flight plan," the relief captain said. "Give us 10 minutes to get settled in the cockpit and we can get you out of here." Keanu nodded. "Take your time." He walked over to the metal bench again. He sat down in the exact same spot where he had waited before. The sun was lower now, casting a golden glow over the airfield. It was peaceful. He watched as the relief captain and the co-pilot, who looked incredibly relieved to see help arrive, went up the stairs and disappeared into the plane. Keanu thought about the captain in the ambulance. He wondered if he would make it. He hoped so. He thought about how strange life was. If he hadn't been denied boarding, he would be sipping a drink in the air right now, oblivious to the tragedy that almost happened. Instead, he was sitting on a hard bench, tired and dusty, but feeling strangely connected to the world around him. 10 minutes later, The co-pilot appeared at the top of the stairs and signaled that everything was ready. The ground crew member who had regained his composure and his professional demeanor walked over to the bench. "All set, sir," the young man said. He was standing up straighter now, his voice clear. "We have you on the manifest this time." Keanu smiled, a genuine, warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Thanks for checking," he said. He stood up and shouldered his bag. As he walked toward the stairs, he paused next to the young man. "Take care of yourself, all right?" "You too, sir," the young man replied. "Have a safe flight." Keanu climbed the metal stairs for the second time that day. This time there was no barrier. The hatch was open, waiting for him. He stepped inside the cabin, and the co-pilot greeted him with a nod of deep respect. "We're ready to take you home," the co-pilot said. Keanu found his seat. It was the same seat he would have sat in an hour ago, but everything felt different. The leather felt softer, the air felt cleaner. He buckled his seatbelt and looked out the window. He saw the young ground crew member standing below, watching the plane. Keanu gave a small wave. The young man waved back. The engines roared to life, vibrating through the floor. The plane began to move, taxiing toward the runway. As they picked up speed, Keanu watched the ground crew member get smaller and smaller. He watched the hangars and the other planes blur past. When the plane lifted off the ground, the nose pointing up toward the darkening sky, Keanu didn't close his eyes. He watched the world fall away beneath him. He thought about the pilot in the hospital. He thought about the young crew member who learned a lesson about kindness. He thought about the strange, winding paths that people take to end up exactly where they need to be. Up here, above the clouds, everything was quiet again. The delay, the panic, the ambulance sirens, they were all just memories on the ground. Keanu leaned back against the headrest, finally allowing himself to relax. He was just a passenger now, on his way to the next place. But he carried with him the quiet satisfaction of knowing that today, just for a moment, he was exactly where he was meant to be. And that was enough.